Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Winter is Coming. My name is Adam Cresswell, and you are listening to a podcast all about housing justice. And we are talking through the last few weeks. We've had our first batch of episodes. Our volume 1 of season 1 is out, and you can listen to all of those episodes now. And we are into volume 2 here, the second half of the season, our second batch of episodes. And we're continuing to look at this topic of housing justice, which is a term that we use to say that we don't just want to live in the reality of a housing crisis. We don't just want to simply respond to a housing crisis, but we actually want to move towards housing justice, which means not just roofs over people's heads, not just lower prices in the market, but actually a society where we really live into what we believe to be a truth, which is that housing is a human right, and that everyone should have access to housing and all that comes with it. The supports, the community. And so we are talking about this in this context specifically as many of our guests, not all, but many, and me, myself as a host, we're coming to you from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. You might know it on your map now as Kitchener-Waterloo. And so we're looking through that particular context because it's important to understand that housing justice and how we respond looks different depending where we are, depending on our the lands that we're on and our location and our context. But also, we're really pleased to hear so much feedback from people in the first batch of episodes that folks all over the country, as far as British Columbia and the Maritimes and Saskatchewan, are listening and able to really get something out of this podcast as well. And so today we are pleased to have another rep from the really incredible organization, which if you don't know it now already, you should. Katherine Bitzer as part of the Affordable Housing Project team at the Working Center. We've had Gemma Ricker on from the Working Center. We hope to have more folks who can chat about the work, because the Working Center has for decades been doing so much to combat poverty and to create a more just city in Kitchener and in Kitchener-Waterloo as a region. And so I'm delighted that Katherine is here today to chat about some of the many different projects that the Working Center is on. And Katherine, you even told me as you came on, you've been working there for like 20 years now. So
that is correct.
Yeah. So you've worked in a number of different roles and on probably so many different projects over the years, because the Working Center is just incredible at responding to needs as they arise. And Katherine is also a longtime member of Trinity United Church, who is part of how this podcast is being brought to you. Trinity is doing really incredible work as they've lived into what does it look like to not just go to church, but to be the church, and to say, how can a community focus not just on getting people together on a Sunday morning for a service, but actually creating the kind of world that we all want to see, a world of justice and liberation and inclusion. And Trinity has made it their primary mission to support housing justice and affordable housing in Kitchener-Waterloo. So it's awesome when we can get this kind of cross-section of folks from Trinity and folks who are in the world like you, Katherine, doing incredible work. So thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. No, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. Maybe just a way to start, just tell us maybe just a little bit about yourself and your role at the Working Center.
Sure. So I am, as you mentioned, a lifelong member of Trinity United Church, and very proud of that. I have grown up and I live and I work and I play in downtown Kitchener. My home is never too many steps from where I spend most of my time, whether that be the working center or places I go with my kids. And then, the Sunday morning trip to Trinity has always been a part of my immediate sphere. As I mentioned, I grew up here. I actually went through a teacher's college to explore a career in education, and I have worked with kids and have really enjoyed that. About 20 years ago, not quite, but nearly 20 years ago, I was asked to come in for a 6-month contract at the working center, just supporting a placement as someone was away overseas. And I said yes. And that has literally turned into a 20-year career.
So 6 months going on 20 years.
That's right. I'm still waiting for that contract end date to,
right, yeah.
to come up. So yes, I have been with the working center a very long time. It's a very special place to me, and has really informed. Well, I would have to say my faith certainly informs what I do, what the choices I've made in life, and the working center is very much a part of that decision making. So I started off in employment counseling, doing the frontline employment counseling work, and then I backed up into a role of supporting the employment counselors, where I was what we call the buffer role between what the government requirements were for our various employment contracts and supporting the employment counselors. And then I was asked actually in January of this year. I had taken a little bit of a break. We were planning a big family road trip. And so I'd taken a bit of a step back from the working center, only going in to support the person who succeeded me in that role. And they said, would you be interested in helping out with the affordable housing stuff that we're doing right now? Because we just need someone in there to help hold some pieces to help move them forward. So that was my step in. That was my foray into the affordable housing piece at the working center. But I want to just backtrack a little bit to talk more about Trinity's role, because I think it's important that you mentioned that, and I'm so proud that Trinity has really taken on supporting housing justice, supporting affordable housing. It's been near and dear to my heart for many, many years. For about 15 years, Trinity was part of the Out of the Cold program, and we were a very big part of it. Actually, we had huge numbers of people who would come for an overnight bed, for supper, and then breakfast the next morning. And so I was part of that team that helped to support that program for quite a number of years. And that came to a close in 2014 with the region's promise that there were enough beds in emergency shelters. And also they were saying, we want we want the churches to support our homelessness to housing strategy. So that was 2014. And so I just wanted to highlight the fact that Trinity had a very big role. This was, certainly a Band-Aid solution, but it was something that we are doing in response to, seeing people outside, seeing people cold, seeing people hungry, seeing people with no place to rest for the night. And so Trinity stepped into that in a very large way, and many, many volunteers were involved, many hours, so much food acquisition, other supply acquisition. And it was something that, the whole congregation really got behind and supported, in a very tangible way. And that was a big part of my initial connection with folks who were either homeless or, living rough or, couch surfing, that sort of thing. So that was my first real strong connection with folks in that precarious situation.
Yeah, I think it's great to point that out too, because we've talked a little bit about in a few of our episodes about the critical role of emergency shelters, but also recognizing they're an emergency response. And so I think it is important to highlight that the Out of the Cold program, I remember it as a kid at a few United churches, and I actually remember as maybe a junior youth, like maybe grade 6 or 7, and someone coming to chat with us, and he was a representative, a leader at Out of the Cold. And I remember that was also one of my first kind of forays into seeing the church response in Kitchener-Waterloo through programs like Out of the Cold, and a few United churches were involved. And so that I can tangibly remember that connection between United Churches in Kitchener and Out of the Cold. And to know that Trinity was a big part of that was something that even I was aware of, going to a different church as a kid.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I was, I did a bunch of different shifts. I was on the setup shift at one point, and then I moved to the overnight shift. And I tell you that 2, 3 in the morning, that's a tough shift to cover, but,
I bet. Yeah.
But, but that's what worked for me at that time in my life. And so I was very happy and proud to be a part of that effort, of the churches. And then just, carrying on with what happened, with those Out of the Cold places closing down, and it was covered 7 nights a week. But then the region, was saying, we feel we can house everybody. We feel we have enough spaces, enough beds in the emergency shelters to house everybody. And we want to focus on moving into more permanent housing, which is great. Mm-hmm. However, 8 years later, they did a point in time count in September 2021. I don't know, I'm assuming this may have been talked about already, but it documented that over 1,000 people in our community were experiencing homelessness. 1,000 people.
Yeah.
And that number is really shocking. And I think you just need to let it sink in for a minute to think about how many people that entails, that are living rough, that are in precarious situations. It's so much more than a number. And what was once hidden, I think, has become so visible in Kitchener. And I think in other places, well, actually, I'm sure in other places across Canada, as we see the tent encampments grow. And it's almost like there's this loud voice saying to the community, saying, don't leave us behind. We're here, right? This is what we're being forced to do right now. And living in tent encampments, I know some people might struggle to look at them and to see them being, take over parks or take over, corners of land, but it's actually a place of safety for people.
Yes. Yeah.
Because when you're out there living rough, you're constantly at risk of theft or assault, or, and even just the toxic drug supply, overdosing.
Yeah.
It's so difficult out there. And so these tent encampments actually are to me, they're a natural response. It's what any human would do. You want to congregate, you want to gather so you can feel safe. And that's what these tent encampments are. And they're glaringly visible, and they're glaringly telling us that we need to do better as a community, that this is intolerable, that people are having to make this choice because there's nothing left for them.
Yeah. When you talk about that it's more than a number, I think that is really important. It's easy in conversations like this, or if you're reading articles, to we see numbers all the time, and we even see numbers in the context of struggle and need. How many people are experiencing housing insecurity, or experiencing living on or close to the streets. And it is really easy to just go, especially a round number like 1,000 has a way of sort of we become desensitized to it. And I think it is really important, like you said, to sit with that and to recognize if for those of us, if you don't know, if you happen to believe, and you probably do, and maybe you just don't know it, but if you think you don't know one person who's experiencing this, just imagine if it was one person that you knew, that you loved, a friend, a family member who is experiencing this, and you would recognize that just that one person, it would turn your world upside down. It would mean everything to you to want to work to find a pathway to healing and wholeness. And then you extrapolate it into there's 1,000. So there's, one is too many. Yes. And we have now 1,000 people in, and by some accounts, it's tripled in the last couple of years from where it was even in 2018, 2019. And I think that you're right. There is, I think it is really important. We haven't had a super deep dive into this yet, but it is really important. We've talked about it on every episode in some way, shape, or form. But to recognize that the encampments that we're seeing, and it's not just in Kitchener-Waterloo, of course, but the encampments, Victoria Park or Willow River Park, and at Victoria and Weber, that it is really important to understand that if we, like you said, if I'm struggling, whether it's with housing or a breakup or something, I go to the people in my community, whether that's friends or family or the people that I can rely on. So to understand that not only is it a challenge to be living in these precarious situations, but to also feel like you're on your own. I think it is really important for people to understand what you said, which this is a natural response to what's going on, and it is incredibly important for anyone to have community. Everyone deserves that, whether they're able to be housed or not. Everyone deserves to have people around them, to have neighbors, and to recognize that we don't do a great job of seeing those and recognizing those who are struggling with housing as our neighbors. We attach labels to them. We attach perceptions to them. They're that person who I see on the exit on Highway 7, or they're that person who's kind of always hanging around the corner by the gas station. These are our neighbors. And so they, as Gemma said in our safe supply and housing episode, just because someone is experiencing housing, they doesn't mean they don't deserve health and life. And I think that applies to community too. And I think that's really important. And that, as you said, I think it's a very important thing. I recognize that it can be a struggle for folks who are in constant proximity to go to think themselves, so what are the implications of this, and do I feel safe being near this? And those are very understandable and valid feelings. But to recognize that these encampments coming together, it's very important that it has made it impossible for us as neighbors, as citizens, and for the region as regional and municipal government to ignore and to just kind of continue Band-Aid solutions or no solutions, or even worse, the criminalization of those who are struggling with housing. And so I think it is really important for us to recognize that these are our neighbors who are naturally responding to the situation that they found themselves in, and that hopefully now we understand, like, this is something that's the housing crisis is affecting everyone at every level. And so to understand that we need to be thinking, how can we support, not how can we shutter or bulldoze or erase or ignore. And it's particularly with the encampments, how can we support our neighbors who are living there?
Absolutely. And so one of the responses of the working center we actually have what we call St. John's Kitchen, which, if you want to give it sort of a colloquial term, is a soup kitchen right across the street from the encampment at Victoria and Weber Streets. And so we, throughout the course of the pandemic, we worked hard to keep access to washrooms, to showers, to laundry, to food, to a warm space, to a space of inclusion. And often the sort of comments that come from people experiencing life in this way is, you saw me as a person. You didn't see me as a drug addict. You didn't see me as someone struggling with mental health issues. Like, the fact that someone feels so labeled all the time is really sad. And they don't even, feel human anymore because of the constant judging. And I mean, I understand too, it can be difficult, and particularly the toxic supply of drugs on the street are mind bending. They alter the brain in such ways that people do act in pretty horrific ways at times. But that's the drugs, and the drug dependency is a whole other huge, and I think you probably touched on this around the safe supply, but that's a whole other conversation around, like, just the type of drugs on the street and how destructive they are to people's lives and people's minds. And so, but that's the reality. And so how can we work with that and continue to invite people in, continue to offer love to people who, need it the most? Absolutely. At this time of year when, as the snow starts to fall and I know that, in the Middle East, there might not be snow at this time of year, but it really makes me think of the story of Mary and Joseph as they travel. And, they're a young, poor couple, dislocated, forced to travel long distance to a place where they're strangers in a strange land, no community connections there, no access to shelter. And despite their need, Mary being with child, they're turned away by most and given hope by one person who did what he could. And that is not just a story to me that, we talk about at this time of year or reflect on at this time of year, but to me, that's an integral part of our Christian faith and how to me, it's a statement, it's a calling to how we should be reaching out to those in our midst today. Because if we don't, then I don't think we're really understanding or we're not really living out our Christian faith. And I'll just put it back on myself. This is how I feel, right? That it is important to take these stories from the Bible and to think about, reflect on, well, what are they telling me? How are they being a roadmap to guide me in my choices and decisions in this day and age? And to me, you can't get much more of a parallel than, when you see all those tents covered in snow, people dislocated, disconnected from their community, just struggling, just looking for someone to give them some hope, looking for someone to give them just something that a bit of love that so often is denied to them. So I could talk a little bit about the working center if for those who may be not so familiar with it.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted because I think that was really important. A lot of the folks who are listening are either perhaps from United Church land or from the Hub, which has a lot of folks from the United Church in it as well. And I think it is. We talked about this at our Christmas service last year, like the one of the core of that nativity Advent story, and for those who come from different perspectives, different traditions, and different backgrounds too, just understanding this as one piece of how we understand the core. One of the cores of that story is there's no room at the inn, and understanding that there's so many of our neighbors who are experiencing that exactly right now, and particularly in winters in Canada and all the threat and danger and insecurity that comes with that. I think that's a beautiful thing to be highlighting as we're just around that Christmas time, just coming out of it, and to be able to stop and recognize that it's good to come together, and particularly in 2022, probably a lot of people have been able to get together in ways that they haven't in the last couple of years. But yeah, to go deeper than just to do the traditions or sing the songs or the carols, but actually think about how this story has just so many deep reverberations when we look around at our neighborhoods and our neighbors is I think a really critical thing, and it really can't be overstated that this is something that we are able to respond to. We're able to be in some way, shape, or form, and we all have different roles to play and gifts to offer, but in some way, shape, or form, I think you said it beautifully. We can be love to our neighbor in some way. We can offer something, whether it's showing up to advocate at a city council or a regional meeting, or offering food or shelter or blankets or space on a property. And that's how a Better Tent City started. Or to even for those of us who are still in a very early learning stage, to offer a lack of judgment, and just
Yes.
to offer to drop a label, or drop a caricature, drop a perception, and to see someone as a neighbor and a person who deserves dignity and respect and love, is a really important thing. And so I think I think it's really important that we just kind of have sit with that and understand that that's the role, no matter if we're connected to the working center or a church or not. That's the role that we can play to each other in our neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And I think that's well said. And when we talk about housing justice and talking about housing as a human right, I mean, whatever, whether you're from a faith tradition or not, we're talking about basic needs here. We're talking about human right. And to have shelter over your head is, can you imagine going night after night trying to carry everything on your back, trying to figure out where you're going to sleep, if you're going to be safe. It means it's exhausting. And so how do people cope? I mean, if anyone, you have some, and most of us do have some mental health challenges, right? But then how that gets triggered when you're under so much stress all the time, and then you throw in the crossroads of how mental health and addiction gets played out, and it's not surprising that we've ended up where we are when housing as a right has been pushed aside. I think, and we have people and I think even people who, as we've talked about, who are early on in their learning, can appreciate the fact that the housing market for those who have means is really difficult, right? There's people who are struggling, who want to be homeowners who can't be, right?
Exactly.
Who want to find somewhere to rent and can't.
Exactly. Yeah. It's out, like purchasing, certainly we know is out of reach for so many people who would have considered themselves even 5 years ago, within reach of that. And that's the same. And as well with the rental market, like and that's why I think it's important to understand this. And I hope it offers that window into understanding and empathy and a desire to respond to those who are living close or living on the streets, to understand that it's been a crisis. It's been a challenge for everyone when we see just these insane, these incredible, I should say, like rental prices, to understand that if it's that difficult for those of us who maybe there's multiple people working full-time jobs, and it's still difficult to be able to do that, to understand when physical or mental health or addictions comes into play too, that how that snowball effect just makes it, just turns it into a situation where it becomes that much more difficult is really important for us to see that window into.
Absolutely. And we can talk about, the spectrum, there's folks, the Working Center really has focusing its work on responding to chronically ill, street-involved people who face deep addictions and mental health issues. And that is not easy work, but that is important work. And that is the work, that is where we find ourselves, and the firm ethic to say it is not okay for people to sleep outside in the winter. Right? No matter what the challenges are, coming from folks who are who have experienced so much trauma in their lives for so many different reasons, it is not okay that people have to end up in a tent, or not even in a tent, outside in the wintertime here in Canada. And so that is the end at which the Working Center works. But there's an absolute spectrum, as we just mentioned, where people are barely making, either they're living at home or at a friend's or couch surfing because they can't get enough money to pay rent. They are, maybe they're having the place or they're renting, but it's really tight month by month. There's people who, once maybe dreamed of owning a home and now just feeling, well, that will never happen for me because I can never, save up enough for down payment. So, so I just wanted to know that there's an absolute huge spectrum. And I think we need to understand that it's a continuum, right?
Yes.
They're not separate silos. And so if we can help folks earlier on in their learning journey to sort of jump in at one of those points and see how that can slide one way or the other. I think that's very helpful because it's very easy to see how, if you're living paycheck to paycheck and then all of a sudden that paycheck stops,
Yes.
what do you do? Right?
Yeah.
Now you're a couch surfer.
Yeah.
Or you're asking, begging friends and family to help you, right? And people don't always have those webs of support.
Yeah. And it's not just, as we know, and we talked about this in a couple episodes, it's not just, it's not only when a paycheck stops, but people get rent evicted all the time. They're renting somewhere and a house or an apartment, and it's going to be sold. And the only very paper thin protection is that there is legislation that's supposed to be in place all the time, but does not always work, which is if you're renting, you're supposed to be able to be offered that. But we know that I have so many stories of friends who have been taken advantage of, and who even that legislation doesn't protect them, and now they're going out into a market that is just criminally overpriced, or as we talked about in another episode, or you have to move because your situation changes. Maybe you need an accessible entryway where you didn't, or bathroom where you didn't before, or maybe your family has grown. And so there's just so many ways that the situations are precarious, even for those who have housing. So again, to understand, and when you talked about when we think about it, the encampments as well, and think about, instead of seeing it as a problem or a danger or something unsavory, to just start understanding through the lens of, I think to myself, how much do I hate moving? Like every time I've done it, it's stressful. It's wrought with problems and challenges and roadblocks and cost. And I'm someone who has not had to live, has not been targeted in a way where I've had to live like close to the streets or live rough. And I already hate it. And then so imagine if that's your daily life, constantly on the move, constantly having to wonder if you've got a space or if you and your possessions are safe. And so again, seeing it through this lens and understanding, and that was a big learning curve for me too. But understanding that, like you said, the encampments are a natural response, that if I was in that situation, I would want those things too, is I think something that as neighbors of folks who are living in encampments, we need to be able to put ourselves into that lane.
Absolutely. Yep. And I just wanted to go back to, the fact that the Working Center has been working with the reality, or walking, I should say, with the reality of homelessness for a long time. And as we know, as we talk about the encampments, that has been hidden for many years from many people's understanding and their eyes, but now it's, it can no longer be ignored. And I think that's unfortunately a good thing, because hopefully it will take us to a different place of more housing justice than, as much as I just saddens me so much every time I go by and I see, as I've mentioned, tents covered in snow. And I've done camping, at the end of the season or early on the season, and I know how cold it is. Even if you have good gear in a tent, when it's cold outside, like, it is unpleasant. It is mind numbing. And so, how you can get up and then just go and say, well, I'm going to go find a job today, right? Like, that's just not
exactly. Yeah.
Not a reality.
To be able, to try and extricate yourself from that situation. That's, the way that when you're in that part of the continuum, it just pulls you into a cycle is something that is just a reality for so many people.
That's right. And so the main focus or the philosophy of the Working Center is to form a web of supports around people. Because we talked about, people come together in encampments to find that security, to find that safety. But there's also a lot of, not a lot of folks helping one another to find healthcare, because no one has had much luck with healthcare, right? You imagine someone walks into a healthcare clinic, a walk-in clinic, and they're probably not going to get the services they need if they, look or smell in a certain way, right? That's just the reality.
Absolutely.
And when you've been turned away enough times, you're not going to bother anymore, right? and also folks don't have the means to say, oh, okay, I'll go, buy us all dinner tonight, right? So that we can eat. So what the Working Center does is we try and form webs of support, and even through our project work around people. So whether it be providing food, providing healthcare, mental health care for sure, and stability in terms of a safer spot to live, whether it be in a shelter or we work towards having more interim, more affordable housing. So it's that if you sort of picture, we all have our webs of support around us, whether we know it or not, right?
Yes,
it might be a relative, it might be a friend, it might be a colleague at work, right? It might be our doctor, right? We have these webs of support.
If you go to university or college, there's there's residence life systems, and there's faculty, and there's office of advisory, and there's sexual education health centers. I think that's a really important thing to point out. We all who are able to live with some housing insecurity, typically those of us who are middle class, and particularly white middle class, we aren't doing things on our own. We have so many webs of support that are around us that we take for granted, or that we don't even realize.
That's right. And so if you sort of think about what your web of support are, and then imagine if someone starts snipping at those strings and see what that might feel like, or where you think you might end up. I think that's a really powerful exercise to play out. Because, if I lost my support of my family, if I lost my support of my friends, if I lost my support of healthcare, right? Where do I find myself? What is my mental state? Where am I going to turn to find comfort? And so these webs that the Working Center very much approaches it on a person by person basis. I mean, we have projects, right? That, like our St. John's Kitchen, I mentioned, sort of like, the soup kitchen, we have a medical clinic, but within those, we focus on the person, saying, okay, how can we help to build that web of support around the individual? And I'll say, like, right now, because of the crisis, and starting in 2019, the Working Center saw there was a need for emergency shelter that wasn't being met, and people were sleeping outside. And so that began our really strong leaning into providing shelter and housing options for people. And currently we support over 300 people within our various housing and shelter projects. And as I mentioned, these are folks who have been living rough for a long time. And so it's deep work with people, but there's a lot of hope to it. And I can just share a story about one of these that came up during COVID, during the pandemic, as we call it, University Avenue, or UA. And I did a previous guest work.
Yeah, we've had Gemma Ricker on, and she spoke about UA in her episode. That was she spent quite a few months working at which is the University Avenue housing project that the Working Center has.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so what I just wanted to note on that is, so it opened up in response to crisis in the midst of the pandemic, opening up in October 2020, and 80 dorm-style bedrooms and some congregate spaces. And it was to support those who were living rough, outside, in a car, on a bench, right? Maybe couch surfing. And it takes, just by having shelter, that's sort of step one. And I'll talk about the housing first model in a minute, but shelter is sort of the, just providing someone shelter and some stability around shelter is step one. And it's been about, so that's now we're coming up on 2 years, and it's incredible, the change, with a lot of intense and intentional work, that a quarter of these original folks have since stabilized enough to move out into different supportive housing.
Yeah. Wow.
So to me, that offers so much hope, because the amount of trauma that people carry with them is so real, and it's so layered and so complex. But with this sort of, saying we're offering shelter and we're offering love, right? It's kind of as simple as that. and to say like, okay, yesterday wasn't a great day, but today's a new day. We're going to start again, right? It's just what everyone wants. Who doesn't want that in life? Like, you mess up, you did things you shouldn't have done, and then to be forgiven and to be given the grace to like say, okay, let's start again, not, okay, well, you're out, right?
Yeah.
Which can be a response. So I just wanted to note that about UA, which was very much, as I mentioned, like no one saw this coming, but it was so necessary. We just made it happen. The Working Center made it happen. And we're coming on the 2-year anniversary, and it's a much different place than it was 2 years ago. As we learn together with the folks, understanding like how to best meet people's needs, how to best, even from something simple as how to best serve food, how to make different things accessible or available at different times. All of those little things, but they make a big difference, because again, when you look at someone as a person, as a human being, and not as you're not sort of just labeling them in a stereotypical way, it just shifts the entire relationship, and it shifts how you can walk with somebody.
Yeah. When you talk about how in the 2 years since University Avenue has been operating, and that 1/4 of the folks have been able to move ahead on that housing continuum and find either stability in terms of housing or employment, and I know this from Gemma's episode as well, like that community, finding again, and this is what is so important about the encampments in our community, in our city, is the stability of having a community, of having people around you who know your story, who will walk with you, who on the worst days are there and will celebrate you on the good days. Having that kind of stability is so important, and like you said, is something we all want. And to think that even in this case, we've seen 25% of the folks move that way is really important, because I think people get locked into the idea, since probably all of us growing up, particularly here in the north of Turtle Island in the 20th century, to be able to just say, well, we've always had folks who struggled with houselessness, or who experienced homelessness. It makes us think that this is just a problem that is just the reality of the way things are, and that it can't change, and that there's little things we can do, but really this is, the sun's going to rise every day, and there will always be people like living on the streets, and only one of those statements is true. And so to actually recognize that University Avenue is an example of finding solutions, and again, understanding it depends on it's all about the community and the context and the individual, but we can actually solve this problem of housing insecurity. We can actually move towards housing justice for people. It's not just a reality that we just have to accept or live with, or at the best just put Band-Aid solutions on. To see that 25% of the folks who have been involved have been able to find stability proves for us that it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's just really important, because our imaginations get so locked into just accepting the way things are and not believing that things can change, particularly on a topic like housing justice, and where we see injustice with housing. And so I just really, really value the work of the Working Center, and for people to really just hear that there are solutions to these things. We can actually tackle these problems if we're willing to invest in the people who are our neighbors, and in supporting them.
Absolutely. And I love how you use the word invest, because that's the next stage, is we need to invest in more housing stock that is affordable, that is supported. I'll go out, not a very far limb to say, high-end condos, we don't need, too many more of them in Kitchener. Because they're not they're not serving the needs of and not just those who I mentioned, who are at the sort of the far end of the spectrum that work with the Working Center, but even the families who are looking for a family home, or for folks who can't afford that sort of level of financial commitment. But I'll go off on that tangent because I could talk all day on that. But
please, we can do a whole episode where you have that tangent, because I couldn't agree more.
We absolutely could. So we want to talk about investing in affordable and supportive housing, which is the housing first model. So if we look at congregate shelters, like the emergency shelters that the Working Center is offering now at the down on King Street at the former Schwaben Club. You get 70 people a night. It's sort of similar to Out of the Cold in that people come and have supper and spend the night and get breakfast and then have to move on for the day. Although I do want to note that there is good news about a 24/7 model that probably will be up and operating by the time this podcast is broadcast. So that is good news, particularly as the winter weather will continue to deepen over the next few months. So life in that sort of congregate shelter or congregate drop-in spaces like St. John's Kitchen, it serves basic needs, right, in the short term. But it becomes unbearable over time. You lack privacy. You lack a place to feel necessarily 100% secure because your stuff is always out in the open. And you lack possibly, there's some restfulness for sure, but you're also sleeping in a room with 60 other people. And if any one of us can imagine that, it's not the kind of sleep you're going to get when you go into your own bedroom. You can close the door and have that sort of just that mental space for yourself.
And how often do all of us need that time?
Oh my goodness.
I just need to be alone for a bit.
Yeah,
and the ability to have that is something that we take for granted. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so the Housing First is a recovery-oriented approach that supports community members who are dealing with the reality of homelessness by providing independent and permanent housing along with additional supports and services. So this Housing First concept is really important to us. And the projects that I'm working on are the affordable housing builds. And I'm so excited to be a part of this. There's the one I'm working on is going to transform the existing building, which currently houses St. John's Kitchen, our medical clinic, our secondhand furniture store. Is going to transform that space into 44 units of affordable and supportive housing. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the first floor and renovate it, and we're going to put in a redesigned medical clinic, one that's actually, we're not sort of fitting people into random sort of funny little rooms because that's the way the building looked. This is going to be purpose built for a medical clinic. And then in the back half of the first floor will be purpose built public showers, public washrooms, public laundry. And then next door to that will be our brand new St. John's Kitchen, which will be a real space of community gathering, offering the same sort of services of hot meal and welcome and inclusion, and, encouraging folks to access the supports that come through the medical clinic, whether it be primary health care or addiction services and supports, or any of the other services that are offered at the medical health clinic. And so that is what's happening right now, is that it's all on paper. No one can see anything what's happening, when you walk by. But I know that, in the background, we have engineers, we have the architect, we have all sorts of people busy, doing their thing that they need to do to bring this building into life, to bring this vision to life. And it's such an exciting project that we're hoping to get shovels in the ground by March 2023, and then completion and occupancy by March 2024.
Oh, yeah.
So that is truly where we need to move to, is how can we come together as a community? And there's other builds absolutely going on in the community.
Yeah.
I can just talk about the one that I know best, but there's lots of other builds. And so if we see that the challenge of maintaining a home, the challenges of maintaining good mental health, the challenge of maintaining good physical health, if that's something that, it's a community concern, it's a community issue. And so when there are folks who are not able to meet those somewhat those benchmarks, then it is a community issue that we need to come together on. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not something that you can ignore and feel that it doesn't affect your life, because it does affect your life. If you can imagine, like, if all of the shelter systems, let me go back there. If all of your support networks were not in place as they are now, how would your life be different? And what would you be asking of your community to help you through that rough time?
Yeah, when we had Kirsten Wright who's a systems engineer working on housing systems she talked specifically about this idea of community wealth. And then that is what we want to move towards, is where we have, like you said, webs of support that we are able to benefit from, and that we're able to offer to others. And that mindset shift to go from it's someone else's problem to how can we as a community respond, I think is really critical. And I think is something that many people struggle with. But again, it's all about putting ourselves in the shoes of someone. When we're at our lowest points, when we're struggling, we want and need our communities around us. We don't, if I've lost my job, or I've lost a loved one, or gone through a horrible breakup, or had to move out of my house for whatever reason, or whatever it is, even if it's separate from housing, I want and need my community around me. And I don't know how I would react if I just heard, well, it's not my problem from everyone, around me. So these are things that, as our neighbors, as humans, depending where your faith tradition is, as children of Creator, that we would want for ourselves, and that we should all want for each other. And that mindset shift from that's their problem, or they probably deserved how they got there, to how can we as a community respond? This is my neighbor. Am I my sibling's keeper? The ability to shift that mindset is, I think, really, really key for us at individual levels, and at municipal levels, at social levels, at government levels, at organizational levels, at church levels.
That's right. And I just want to, I mentioned my work is very much, and my choices in life have been very much driven by my faith over the years, and that's something that I'm pretty it's very central to me, and even folks from different faith traditions, there's so much commonality between the basic following the golden rule, right? Love thy neighbor as yourself, right? Those are not just messages from any one faith tradition. And for me, another passage, I was hungry and you fed me, I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was homeless and you gave me a room. I was shivering and you gave me clothes. I was sick and you stopped to visit. I was in prison and you came to me. And if you've done any of these to the least of them, then you've done it for God. And so I think that is another really important driver of my own work. There's similar concepts in other faith traditions that say, really, can you help someone with their most basic needs? And if you are helping another person here on earth, then you are also living out in the way that the Creator is asking us to live out.
The ability for us as community members, and again, from whatever tradition, whether we come from a faith tradition or not, to be able to live into that reality of seeing ourselves in the eyes of another person, of being able to dream that it doesn't have to simply be the way it is, but that there are better ways that we can treat each other, that we can live, and that all the way up to the details of that we don't have to do housing in the way that we've always done it. And clearly something needs to change, because again, whether we've been living close to the streets or not, everyone now, for the last, year and a half, we have the headlines that we know we're in a housing crisis at every level, should prove to us that this can't continue in the way that it is, and that work happening at places like the Working Center are showing us that alternative vision for what it means to be a neighbor, to love someone, to offer what we can to someone who is in need, and to learn ourselves how we are in need. And I think that's part of what is so difficult for people, is because it's the water that we swim in. We're just so used to the way things are. And like I said, whether it's, there's typically, someone at that street corner, or, for the last year, that encampment's been there for a while. And so because we just get so used to it, it's hard for us to imagine, okay, well, or maybe I know that it doesn't have to be this way, or I don't want it to be this way, but what does the other way look like? And I think that's why getting the work and the stories from places like the Working Center, and the stories that you've shared about the work here today is so critical, because we have to be able to see what that alternative vision is, what that alternative reality is, where University Avenue was formerly was it a residence or was it a hotel originally?
Yes. No, I believe it was a residence.
It was a residence.
Yep.
So to look at a place and say, instead of just a building that was being not used by the University of Waterloo anymore, or instead of seeing how that could become, another McDonald's or Subway or office space or condos or high-end condos, the Working Center saw this space and said, we have the ability to house X number of people here, and not just give a roof over their heads and get them out of the cold, but to give them permanence and stability and supports and community and a pathway to moving forward into a more secure space on the housing continuum. The Working Center and the folks that you and the folks who are there saw that vision and saw that potential, and then guess what? Realized it, and it's happening.
Yes.
and it's not, it wasn't just an in theory, and it wasn't just this pie in the sky, we'd all love for things to be better. They saw and they put in the work, and they've proven to us as members of folks who live in what we now call Kitchener-Waterloo, that it is possible to do things in a different way, and that these things can be successful. I think a lot of people get into the mindset of these dreams of how society could look just aren't realistic, but we have the actual real stories of people, the real accounts of how this work is happening. And so it's time that we just move aside from that perception that there's nothing we can do about this, or that the best we can do is emergency shelters, or that the best we can do is put up big houses and condos on the Greenbelt, and somehow that's what's going to solve the crisis that we're in. We have so many people like you and like the Mancinis and all the people that are at the Working Center that are doing this work, and we need to invest in how can we show up and support this work, whether financially or by a volunteer or by a staff or by advocating for the work happening in city council meetings, in school board trustee meetings, and at our churches. You've mentioned today particularly just how your faith has been so central to this work, and that's inspiring for me and for those of us who are from the Hub, who is the other half of how this podcast comes. Jesus, justice, and inclusion is what we strive to live out. And so for those who are coming from churches or any community organization, if you're listening and you're not as part of a church, but particularly for those who are listening from any community organization or church, to say, how can we respond as a community to our neighbors in need? And we've had a couple churches already reach out that have heard the story of what Trinity has been doing, and saying, how can we get involved in that same way? And to recognize that where you have community wealth, whether in a family or friend or a work network or a work situation or a church, or you're a volunteer at a school or at a restaurant or anything, how can we leverage that community wealth to respond to this? Is an important question that we need to be asking ourselves. We don't just have to be employees of the working center to be doing this. And we heard that from Gemma. Gemma Ricker had just finished school and saw the posting on Indeed and got involved in University Avenue for a year. And we all have the ability to respond to this situation, and we all have the ability to move housing justice forward. And the first step is getting that perception that there's nothing we can do about this, and just trashing that because it's just not true. And the work of University Avenue and the Working Center, not just UA, but the Working Center over decades, is proof that better ways are possible.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, you don't have to be an employee at the Working Center, right? If you can change how you see someone, change how you talk to your kids or to your friends or to your neighbors about, the tent encampment and the folks who might be living there. You can advocate for more, for more affordable, supportive housing stock in this community. And then you can even go as far as, it's a time of year where, we're opening our hearts and our wallets. I mean, there's lots you can donate to at this time of year to help keep people warm. And so all of that is so important. And we can all do it. It's all possible. And yes, there is a way forward, but we have to commit to it as a community. And, community contributions are a huge part of it. And I would argue that it would be very difficult without, but the reason that things are able to move so quickly these days, Adam, is that there's been a shift ever since I think it's become so visible. There's been a shift in understanding of the severity of the situation. And so therefore there's been a shift at a political will level. There's been a shift at a funding level. And there's been a shift at, folks who are stepping up and saying, I want to help financially. And that is what is allowing this positive pathway forward to happen.
Yeah, and like I said, that we don't want to see anyone having to live outside or having to live in encampments, but recognizing that that our neighbors who have had the courage and the endurance and the resilience to form these encampments have been the biggest reason why steps have been taken forward. And so also to recognize that for those of us who aren't experiencing this housing insecurity in the same way, our role to be able to come and advocate and support is essential, as the folks who are experiencing this lead us in saying, these are what the solutions look like for my community, or for me, or for my family, or for my friend who is living, next to me here. And the encampments have provided that. Beacon is one way to say it, and highlighter that inability to ignore this. And so it is really important for us to laud the work and the efforts of those who are living in encampments at creating their own path to no longer being sideswept or ignored or made invisible, so that change can really happen. As we kind of steer here towards kind of a landing pad, what's one thing that you want people to walk away from this conversation understanding or knowing about housing justice?
I think housing justice is something that we need to be aware is that it affects, the injustice of housing, if I can go to the opposite, affects all of us. So where there is injustice in one part of our community, there is injustice in all of our community. And the strings between the various pieces, between the various people, as invisible as they might be at times, they are real and they are there. And so when there's injustice in one end of it, then it affects everyone and all of us. And so if we can see that as in a more holistic way, that housing justice is something that we all must be a part of, and that it is a universal, a basic human right. And if we can shift our thinking and our lens to that, as opposed to, so-and-so must, there must be a reason why they're on the street, or maybe they want to live that way, or it's nothing to do with me. Those are all false narratives, because housing injustice, when it's experienced by any one person, ripples through and is experienced by everyone. And so if we can change our mindset towards it, then, and we can offer love instead of judgment, then we'll be in a much better place.
That's a beautiful place for us to land. I'm so grateful for the work, Katherine, that you are doing. 6 months going on 20 years at the Working Center, and the work in your own life. Like, as you're saying, you're talking about shifting that mindset, and it's clear that that's been work that you've been engaged in yourself. And so again, it just you're helping us see through your story and your life and your work at the Working Center, the art of the possible, and that we can shift our mindsets. We can see things in a different way. We can imagine that something is possible, and we can actually achieve that different reality, that different possibility. It doesn't just have to stay a dream, but it can actually be realized. So thank you so much for taking time and chatting with us today. I would love to have you come back and chat with us again in a future episode, because I just know having worked at the Working Center for 20 years, I would just love to hear more stories. And I'm sure there's so much more you could tell us about how we move towards justice and housing justice. And at that core, as you talked about, at its most core, loving our neighbor. And I'm particularly grateful as someone who comes from a Jesus tradition too, for just the way you've been inspiring and expressing how integral your faith is connected to your work. And for those of us at the Hub, that's something we always want to be able to move towards. And I'm sure those who are listening from Jesus traditions appreciate it too. And so no matter where you're listening from, we're really glad that you have joined us as well for this conversation. And we're excited to continue this next week and to talk more about how we go from housing crisis to housing justice. Katherine, thanks so much for being with us this week. And for Winter is Coming, I'm Adam Cresswell, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.